Mr. Chair, your recording should be starting right now.
Okay, let's go ahead and do a roll call.
Okay, Miss Allard. Miss Allard. Okay, Mr. Constant.
Mr. Constant said that he would be missing this meeting.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Miss Kennedy. Miss Kennedy. Okay, Miss LaFrance.
Here. Here.
Okay, Miss Kennedy is here.
Kennedy. Oh, it's
Thank
Kennedy,
you.
Yes, thank you.
Miss LaFrance. Okay, Mr. Perez Verdilla. Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Peterson will also be missing this meeting.
Thank you. Miss Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Here. Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Ms. Zolotel.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is a work session on the municipality's response to COVID-19 and declaration of emergency timeline. So this is the first in a series of meetings so the Assembly can get a firm understanding of where we are at and where we are going to be, so that we can address the best uses of the federal stimulus coming our way and then make informed decisions regarding possible extension of the emergency declaration. So specifically, today is about an update on Safe Anchorage and the emergency declaration, which ends on June 5th unless we take action. Just a quick reminder, we are going to be receiving a report on from the administration on their rationale for any extension of the emergency declaration. That was something that was amended into the last extension of the emergency declaration. And this is a good opportunity for members to ask any questions to the administration on additional information needed to make our decisions. So with that, I think we have Incident Commander Bill Falsey here to kick us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I took it as my assignment just to make myself available for questions for what might be happening at the Emergency Operations Center. I think I can clarify for the group that the work is somewhat fractured in the sense that initially, as we were standing up our direct response to all of the COVID needs, I moved over to the Emergency Operations Center and helped with that effort, which consisted of all our personal protective equipment, finding and distribution, standing up the shelter system. And in the meantime, while the various emergency orders were being crafted, that work largely moved over to Chris Schutte and Natasha Pineda with Jason Bach instead. So I had less on point for all of the ins and outs of the various emergency orders and more on point for just what's been happening in the Emergency Operations Center. And like I said, for those who've been especially seeing the Tuesday briefings, rather than repeat everything that's being said there, I'll just sort of say at a high level that the 4 objectives that we have been looking at, protecting the vulnerable, flattening the curve, raising the bar, and then assisting with the various emergency orders, have put us into something of a steady state right now for so long as the disease remains at about the level that it is. So on the protecting the vulnerable, that's largely been standing up the Boakey-Sullivan sheltering operation. As a reminder from the very beginning, we did that because our existing shelter system was too compressed and people couldn't comply with the CDC guidance to remain 6 feet apart. So we stood up an additional sheltering capacity. That system has been successful. The testing that has happened in those populations so far has been encouraging. We have not had positive cases. We did intercept someone who came in from out of state who was headed to the sheltering system. We put them into travel quarantine. Turned out they were actually positive. We had them in isolation and that didn't move through the community. So that's been good. The emerging new trend on the sheltering system is that the Boakey and Sullivan usage is increasingly going down, and we are thinking through what happens next. We have always known that Boakey-Sullivan was the thing that we could do quickly to achieve the separations that we wanted, but not the optimal thing for the long term by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't yet know what is the new long-term solution, but it's something that we're going to be talking about with the assembly going forward. In the meantime, though, it may well be that we can figure out how to slowly pull back from that current Boki Sullivan setup, and we'll, as soon as we know what we're going to be able to do, we'll pass that along. The isolation and quarantine facilities have been sufficient for our needs so far. If we have a large uptick, we might need to do something else, but we were ready to catch the large uptick with the Dempsey Anderson Arena, and then realized that we had had a lot of social success, and so we had more capacity than we needed, and so that is increasingly being turned off. We are exploring whether we can move completely away from the Dempsey Anderson solution. And then the contact tracing and monitoring is up. You've been seeing on the Tuesday updates how they had a much larger workload in mid-April than they do now, and we still have got additional school nurses waiting in the wings to help us if that starts to pick up as we enter into the easing up phase rather than the hunker down phase. The alternate care site facility at UAA is up and ready. We've largely turned the keys over to the state and the 3 hospitals, and that I suspect will remain ready to go until we all determine that we don't need it anymore. We are continuing to get some personal protective equipment donations from interesting places, largely nonprofit or community organizations from people who had some sort of connections to China. The thing that may be encouraging about that is that it may well portend that the regular supply lines are going to start to be opening up more soon. Once the supply lines are functioning in a more normal way, then that workload will disappear because we don't really need to be in the business of procuring masks and face shields and gloves for the medical community. It was only because no one could buy those things on the regular market that we jumped into that effort. But so far so good. No one has been unable to perform an essential medical procedure because they ran out of supplies, and we still have a good cache of supplies on hand. And in the meantime, the state was able to procure a large shipment from China. They now have good supplies on hand for the state. So we're continuing to watch that, but all that seems to be good. And then otherwise, we are just providing metrics and monitoring whatever science that we've been able to scoop up to support the rest of the effort. Pivoting to the main topic of this work session, like I say, I'm sort of set up the opening act before I turn it over to others. But in the main, what has been helpful about having the emergency order in place and what may be helpful as we look to the future is that we do believe that virtually all of our activities are direct response to national emergency activities, and that the presence of the local emergency order will be a part of our FEMA reimbursement story. And so to the extent that we're going to be incurring costs at any level, it is helpful to have the local emergency in place so that we can continue to say truthfully that those are direct response costs. And then if things do change on us quickly, and we have to do something more dramatic in response to a dramatic change on the circumstances on the ground, that's of course the other thing that the emergency order helps us do. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, I would look to pass the baton to Jason or Chris if they have anything they'd like to add.
Thanks. So I just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance. And then, yeah, I guess at this time, if there are any questions for Mr. Falsey, we can go ahead and take those. And then we can turn it over to Mr. Schutte and Mr. Backenstadt to fill us in on the emergency orders and the underlying emergency declaration. So any questions for Mr. Falsey? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Backenstadt and Mr. Schutte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't physically see if Mr. Backenstadt is getting ready to speak or not, so I will just go first to add a little more color to what Incident Commander Falsey, which I just love calling him Incident Commander Falsey, previewed for you guys. So to fill in some of the gaps on what's happening with the mass shelter, mass quarantine isolation facilities, as he mentioned, on the quarantine and isolation side, we have essentially turned that facility down so that it is no longer functioning as a mass isolation, mass quarantine facility, but it is still configured and arranged to accommodate that function if we see a need for it. I do not have a solid timeline from the mass care group within the EOC on how long we would expect that facility to remain in a ready state before we convert it back to a previous use. But that is the current status of that facility. On the mass shelter campus, we are beginning to implement our consolidation functions. The consolidation will try to move as much of the services currently being provided across 2 separate facilities and a parking lot into a single facility. This is in line with our plan as presented to the Assembly earlier this spring, which still feels like half a year ago. But we committed to the community and to the Assembly that we did have a plan in place to demobilize the mass care and mass shelter facilities, and we are beginning that process. The phase 1 of the mass shelter is to consolidate into a single structure. And it looks like as of today, from the experts in the mass care group, it appears that the Sullivan Arena is going to be the likely candidate for the consolidation, given its larger size and the fact that the meal function and a lot of the admin functions provided by the current contractor are stationed in the Sullivan Arena. So that will give us a better venue to consolidate those activities. I don't know how many of the Assembly members are regular readers of the shelter count dashboard, but just to give you a brief overview, last night we saw about 150 individuals out of the 240 in the Sullivan Arena. The Boki, by comparison, had 50. So we're already beginning to see those numbers track downward. And so by consolidating the 2 together, we think we can provide same level of service and do it out of 1 facility. Looking ahead, we would like to begin planning for what the next steps are as we transition out of the emergency state declaration period and move back to what we think is regular life. As you all know, part of what precipitated the decisions to stand up the mass shelter and the mass care isolation facility was the guidance that came out of CDC specific to COVID-19 that increased the separation distance required between sheltered individuals when they are bunking or sleeping in a shelter. I expect that will become the new norm even as we get into a post-COVID world. So we are quickly and diligently dealing with the, I think, reality now that the world of sheltered homeless individuals will look much different in 2021 than it did in 2019 or the first part of 2020. And as part of that, we will be working closely with the Assembly on the various options that are currently being developed. And unless Bill wants to fill in anything, or Jason, I think that's the extent of what I know on the mass shelter, mass isolation.
Thanks. Before we go on to Jason, I do have a question for you, Ms. Salatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Schutte, can you tell me a little bit? I have been tracking the dashboard and I do see that the usage has gone down. Do we know if that is due to less need or other options that people are exercising? And is there, second question is there also discussion about what our new capacity needs will look like once the mass shelter is demobilized that we should be considering due to the CDC guidance? Sure.
I don't know the full answer to your first question. So where are people going or what is happening? I know that there is some degree of success that we are seeing from the resource hub that was established outside the Boki, which is designed to connect sheltered homeless individuals with the services and or housing options that are available. So that's part of the answer. The rest of the answer, I will be honest, I don't know off the top of my head, but I will reach out to the homelessness experts who are there on a semi-daily basis and get you a more full answer later. As to the second part of the question, do we know what the capacity will be in a post-COVID world? And I don't know exactly, because it is unclear whether the CDC guidance, which is in place as a result of the COVID pandemic, will stay at exactly the same guidance that it is today. In other words, as we begin to move past COVID, will the CDC back off of that, and will we see shelters begin to populate again with a smaller separation distance? I think the short answer in the near term is no, because there's a concern about the virus making a comeback, and I think rightly so. Most shelters and providers are being very cognizant of that fact and will want to put in place measures that help protect those populations for as long as they can. So to that degree, I believe that there will continue to be larger separation distances in place and other protective measures. What does that do to the overall supply of bed spaces? Our experience in mobilizing the mass shelter to begin with was that it had a pretty significant effect on the existing shelter space. And in some cases, it cut it in half, but that's not the universal answer, because each facility is a little bit different. And so again, much like the first part of the question, I can do some more digging and get you the actual numbers, at least as best we know, for the various shelters.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions for you, Chris. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just going to have a few brief comments about the underlying emergency proclamation. As you correctly pointed out at the beginning, when the Assembly ratified the extension last time, they did add in the request that any additional extension from the administration come with a written document explaining the reasoning behind that. I will give you a brief preview that we will likely be asking for an additional extension, probably in the 4-week time frame, for a couple of different reasons. One, as Incident Commander Falsey mentioned, it is very helpful to have the underlying emergency declaration in place for FEMA reimbursement. And then secondly, as everyone is aware, we are still in the middle phasing, phase 2 of reopening. We are working very collaboratively and closely with the state on their phasing, and as well as ours. And if you just kind of look at a calendar and the number of phases that we still have to go through, before we get to the end of that, we will likely slide by the June 5th date. So with that, we will obviously put a lot more into writing when we submit the request to the Assembly, but that is just a way of a preview that we will likely be asking for an extension past June 5th.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this isn't a question so much as just a comment for you, Mr. Bockenstadt. And I'm sure that you guys are already going to do this, but I want to just stress if you come back to us with a request to extend the emergency declaration, that we're very clear about in our messaging about this is not an extension of any given emergency order or anything like hunker down. I mean, the misinformation got around the world before the truth got its pants on, as they like to say, the last time we did this. And so I just hope that you can craft the written document and any other additional messaging in such a way that we can prevent the kind of misinformation conflagration we had last time. Thank you.
Through the chair, Assembly Member Dunbar, point well received, and we will certainly do that.
Thank you. Mrs. Alatow.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, I guess, to what extent, I don't know, I'm just trying to get my head around all of it. So obviously at the federal level, there's a push to kind of open. The state level is moving to open. Municipal level, we seem to be following closely behind what the state is putting out. So in terms of continued need for an emergency declaration, I guess I'm not 100% certain or clear what particular, like maybe just on the higher level right now, I know those specifics will come. We're thinking needs to be in effect other than if it's the restrictions that will continue to exist and persist for a period of time under the emergency orders.
So, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Backenstadt, this is Chris. I'll take first swing at that, and then everything that I get wrong, Jason will clean up. So there's two key reasons why the emergency declaration is important. And you touched on one of them, which is without the overarching emergency declaration, the issuance of individual emergency orders can't happen. So if we find ourselves in a position later this summer, for example, if the declaration were to expire in June, any sort of resurgence of the virus, et cetera, would have to start the entire process all over again. Having the overarching declaration in place, as long as it's clearly communicated to the public in the assembly, as Assemblymember Dunbar suggested, I think provides the authority to act quickly and act nimbly if we ever see a resurgence of the virus later this year or later this summer. The second reason it's important is tied directly to some of the financial questions as it relates to FEMA. It is an important part of being able and eligible to receive reimbursement for a lot of the expenses that the municipality is incurring right now in its response to the COVID pandemic. And there is significant concern that if there is no overarching emergency declaration, then any expenses incurred by the municipality would fall to simple general government and would not be eligible for reimbursement. So those are two sort of broad reasons why the emergency declaration is valuable and important. And then I will let Mr. Backenstadt fill in the gaps.
May I ask actually a really quick follow-up on that last point, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Thank you. If the federal emergency were to end, does that necessarily precipitate the end to the municipal emergency? I know we've declared emergencies outside of the federal government prior, but I guess I need a little bit more on the interplay there because I feel like the federal government's moving quite quickly toward potentially an end to its emergency.
So I'll give you a real short answer I have about the kindergartner's equivalent of familiarity with all of the ins and outs of FEMA rules. But you stated it correctly, which is there can be individual jurisdictions with a declaration of emergency. But the current state that we live in this country is that there is a national declaration of emergency, which by extension opens the FEMA disaster recovery process to all states and localities that are affected by it. The state of Alaska's declaration of emergency, I do not believe would, I'll have to get back to you on the full answer to that, what happens if the state declaration goes away or the federal, but the short answer is without the federal declaration, the FEMA process would change and we would be in a position similar to what we were in the November 30 earthquake, where it is a regional specific, a state specific or a regional specific emergency declaration.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Jason Backenstadt. Yes, Mr. Schutte got that almost 100% correct, that the way that it typically works in any disaster is the local jurisdiction will declare an emergency and are required to essentially exhaust or expend the funds that they have available to respond to the disaster, and that typically then the request then goes to the state. The state declares a disaster, and you go through the same process that they have to be able to expend any and all funds or ability to respond. And then once that has been satisfied, the state will then request a national or a state specific from a federal disaster. But as Mr. Schutte said, we have a nationwide disaster declaration right now. I could see a point in time in the future where it gets back to what we typically see, where there's a federal disaster declaration for individual states that might see a cases. But what that would necessarily mean with the number of cases that we're seeing, that maybe that doesn't apply to the state of Alaska anymore. And as Mr. Schutte correctly noted, when that happens, that would obviously change our calculus, because it would prevent our ability from getting reimbursed through FEMA, at least during that process.
Thank you. All right, moving on to Ms. Kennedy.
Actually, Mr. Chair, my questions were very similar to Ms. Zolotel's. So I think I've got the information that I need. And what it tells me is we really can't make a very educated guess on this right now as to what the status of the FEMA funding and the emergency declaration connection really could be by June the 2nd or June the 5th. So anyway, I'm just going to be watching this and looking for some more updates on that as we get closer to that date. Thank you. Great,
thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the purpose of this work session, explore any issues or additional information that folks may need. So I'm not opposed to ending this early, but want to give another opportunity for folks if they want to ask any questions or need any additional information in advance of a potential June 2nd vote. While folks are thinking about questions, I'll turn it back over to the administration. Does anyone have anything to add? Mr. Bockenstad, Mr. Schutte, or Incident Commander Falsey?
This is Jason. I have nothing further to add.
And this is Mr. Schutte. I don't have anything to add, but we are available for questions. I know at one point, Assemblymember Dunbar pointed out correctly the difference between the emergency declaration and the emergency orders. I know this work session is about the declaration, but if you have any questions about the specific orders or the attachments, et cetera, we're here to answer questions.
Okay, thank you both. I'll go ahead and go to Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we talk a little bit about what potential FEMA requests we may have pending that we don't know about yet, and whether or not we will have anything outstanding come June 2nd?
I'll start and hope that Incident Commander Falsey is still listening so he can chime in. My understanding of where we are at in the FEMA reimbursement process is that we have submitted our first reimbursement request to FEMA, but that it covers activities through, I want to say through March. I could be wrong on the exact date. I guess another way to say it, Assemblymember Zolotel, is that we have not submitted all reimbursement requests through FEMA as of yet, and I don't think we'll be done with those by June 5.
And this is, if I don't know if Mr. Falsey is still on, but I will just add on that I also don't know the specific date, but I will say that the amount of FEMA reimbursement that we have applied for to date is a little north of $9 million.
This is Bill. Sorry, I was multitasking, listening to a state call while we were proceeding. But that's right. Jason and Chris have gotten the figures correct. The FEMA process here is a little bit different from the earthquake process in that we're asking for reimbursement in the middle of it rather than after we've cleaned up all of the costs and submitted a final all-in request. The term of art is they call them project worksheets or something, and so we've submitted this one for about $9 million. We have not received any money from FEMA yet, and there are some uncertainties. It's not exactly clear how the FEMA public assistance reimbursement process is supposed to interface or not with the CARES Act money. But as soon as we learn more, we're happy to pass it along. Right now, we are just playing the FEMA process the way the normal FEMA process is set up.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and move on to Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about the reimbursable FEMA costs. As I understand it, the costs for the day-to-day operating costs of the EOCs, as well as the mass shelters and mass quarantine isolation facilities, I mean, those have daily operating costs. As long as we need to or continue maintaining those, that's reimbursable or partially reimbursable by FEMA, aren't they? So
Sorry, Mr. Gates, I don't know if you had anything else to your question. It sounded like you were in the middle of a sentence, but if you don't have anything else, I guess we can turn it over to someone from the administration to answer.
yes. Okay, let me clarify. We have these daily operating costs for those actions that we've taken to deal with the COVID-19 emergency, the mass shelter, the Dempsey Anderson for medical response, and the emergency operations center. If those are going to continue to be open past June 5th, well, those are reimbursable FEMA costs, isn't that right, or partially? And therefore, you'd want to extend the declaration as long as we keep those operating.
This bill, I think that that accords with our best understanding that those should be FEMA reimbursable costs as part of the core emergency response, so to maintain that 6-foot decompression. So we think the answer to that is yes.
And this is Chris.
And I guess to follow up.
I was going to say, Dean, if you'll let me add some additional color to what Mr. Falsey reported. Not only are the ongoing expenses of the response work at the mass shelters reimbursable, but keep in mind that we have mobilized a significant portion of the municipal workforce in their capacity as EOC team members, and the day-to-day work occurring at the EOC, including labor costs, is something that is similarly reimbursable. So we are seeing a number of we did see a number of our employees get mobilized for service at the EOC. That is certainly beginning to slow down a little bit these past few weeks, but those costs are similarly reimbursable.
And I guess to put that another way, if the emergency declaration is terminated, but we continue to have those facilities and that staff in place, that jeopardizes being able to ask for FEMA reimbursement, yes or no?
I believe the answer is yes. We can ask if there is ever a scenario where you can continue to spend money to an emergency that you have declared is no longer in existence, but still believe that you are entitled to receive reimbursement for your response costs in the post-emergency. I just don't think that's the way the FEMA setup usually works. Once you've said we're no longer in an emergency, then I think FEMA typically says, well, the money that you're spending in your non-emergency period is no longer reimbursable public assistance. You're post your emergency.
Oh, is that still true if the governor's emergency declaration's been extended to November and still in place? So does that not make a difference in terms of the municipality getting FEMA reimbursement locally?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to, actually. So if we let the local emergency expire, but the state emergency was still in effect, but we were still spending local dollars, could we then say we've got shelter operating costs for October in a post-local emergency, but still a statewide emergency? Can we have reimbursement there? I don't know the answer is the candid answer. And then the further complication is there are two buckets of money because the CARES Act also had this COVID relief fund, which may be separate and apart from all of this declarations of disaster. So it is not clear, but not because we haven't been sort of studying it. In part, the federal law that just passed recently added a lot of ambiguity to how the two systems are supposed to work together. We can answer though on the what happens if the local emergency turns off and the state one remains. We have a resource in Florida who has been helping us with the reimbursement. We can put that question to him and see what he can tell us about all that.
Bill, this is Chris. I'll actually start the answer for you. The short answer is no. So in the same way that a state would declare an emergency and forward that declaration to the president, the local jurisdictions are in the same boat. So in other words, if let's imagine a world where COVID only hit Anchorage, Anchorage would have to declare its emergency, and the president would have to authorize that emergency in order to open up what's known as the public assistance pool of money at FEMA. Public assistance is the primary grant program that gives the money to communities who are spending money to mitigate some natural disaster, or in our case, some public health disaster. So I believe the answer is that we would, if we did not have our emergency declaration in place, we would not be eligible for the public assistance pool of money from FEMA, which is the 75-25 reimbursement.
Thank you. I see your point. I sort of think there's another aspect here. If that municipal proclamation of emergency is terminated, but we still have emergency ordinances, and those usually are appropriating for our costs, and because it's an emergency ordinance, it's outside the tax cap for whatever's not being reimbursed. Anyway, I guess there's a bunch of things to consider, but it does sound like it's more, I guess, substantiates our ability to ask for the reimbursement if we have our local proclamation in place, and without it, the state and federal emergency still effective, we're a little more uncertain about our ability to collect from those buckets. That's sort of what I'm hearing or seeing. Is that
yeah,
right?
and this is Chris. I'll add. Let me add something to the way you phrased that last part, Dean. So, in a world where the emergency declaration for Anchorage expires, and we are only operating under the still existing state emergency declaration, it is my understanding, and Bill can correct me if this is wrong, that at that point the response to COVID in Anchorage would have to transition to the state EOC for them to take care of and seek reimbursement from FEMA. In other words, we would lose our ability to have an emergency response.
Oh, thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to give one last opportunity for anyone to put themselves in the queue. Otherwise, I'm going to close this up. All right, I'm not seeing anyone. Thanks to the administration for presenting and answering questions, and I guess we'll look forward to fleshing out some of the issues brought up today during the work session and for the formal written report in the coming weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bob.